Hi everyone. I'm going to be going over chapter 7 of Angus Fletcher's Wonderworks today. The chapter is titled Jettison Your Pessimism. In this chapter, Fletcher takes a look over the literary genre that we have determined to be fairy tales. Despite the name, not all of these stories contain fairies, but they do often entertain mythical and magical elements. The greatest trend in this genre is the happily ever after ending, where our protagonist's story ends continuously on a high note. It's very upbeat, usually with a greater accumulated wealth or a wedding as a resolution. Fletcher, however, studies the two very separate trains of thought that have split philosophers over centuries on how these endings affect our brains when readers are exposed to them. It is important to mention that the happily ever after reemerged full force during the Renaissance era after years of widespread Christian and Islamic ideology subsided slightly to an era of rationalist enlightenment. The fairy tale, which initially promoted ideas of happenstance and coincidence, was not very popular to the Middle Ages, who saw serendipity and randomness as kind of a threat to the idea of godly intervention and predetermination. As 15th century philosophers became more rational, so did its writers, in a way. Fairy tales, you will see, are where literary critique and our brains diverge in opinion. Some writers rely on the virtue of their characters, others on chance. I'm going to start with chance fairy tales, or those that contain the lucky twist, as Fletcher calls it, because those date all the way back to Greek tragedies and comedies, when gods would randomly descend from a jerry-rigged contraption on the ceiling. They would literally fall from the top of the stage, which was known as the Deus Ex Machina, to randomly solve all of our protagonist's problems. Sometimes they turn a funeral into a wedding. Other times, the uncalled for help from a god would just create more problems in the long run. The characters of these stories encounter some form of intervention that is completely unexplained or downright illogical. This is simply the lucky twist, and as Fletcher describes it, it is an arbitrary breaking of the laws of reason. The lucky twist, however, is the opposite of what's known as poetic justice. Poetic justice, which arose to counter that lucky twist for its bad plot devices and poor literary quality. It embodies the phrase like begets like, that good begets good and bad begets bad. Good, virtuous characters receive good endings, while the bad get bad. Charles Perrault's classic Cinderella captures this literary scheme as the girl herself, beautiful and courteous, is treated horribly by her evil and ugly stepfamily. However, because Cinderella is the spitting image of nobility, just dressed in rags and covered in soot, we are given the sense that she inherently belongs in the realm of courtesans, not the kitchen staff. The fortune that drives her story is prompted by her innate virtues, not happenstance. Perrault and like-minded 15th century writers and many, many more modern critics look at the lucky twist with disdain, seeing it as lazy and undeveloped writing. Fletcher rebukes these criticisms, and in his own fashion, he, of course, looks to science to explain why we continue to see the prominent lucky twist in our stories. So let's bring in the brain. Fletcher points to the separation between the left and the right sides of the brain, which 18th century scientists figured out work in conjunction with each other, not as a whole, as we initially thought. Much more recent studies have debunked different myths about it, like one side being more creative and the other being a little bit more technical. But studies are actually pointing towards a legitimate need for an evolutionary separation of tasks by the left and right side of our brains. The left brain is more versed in calming and comforting responses and maintaining kind of composure, while the right is looking for a potential fight or flight risk. So I would say the right side is doing a little bit more risk assessment. The other side of the brain is trying to rationalize and figure out what's secure and safe. In translation, we experience more negative stimulation when using the right portion of our brain and positive in our left. This is the same with our emotions, too. They've seen that overactivity of the right brain can lead to depression and anxiety. Long-term and severe effects of these may even result in heart attack or suicide. They're all going to stem from that overactivity in the right side of the brain. Well, what does that even have to do with fairy tales and luck and poetic justice? Fletcher claims that rational stories where virtue leads to a happily ever after actually give us less benefit than their lucky twist using counterpart, and contribute to a literary hangover effect where happiness wears off once we realize the virtue displayed by the fortunate character is not a universally owned trait. Sheer luck, on the other hand, gives us the same sense of wonder that we discussed last week. But in addition, it can stumble upon anyone in the form of a prince or fairy or treasure, any kind of reward that simply comes for no reason. It's never asked for, it's never even wanted in a way, but it just stumbles upon them. Often to someone who is completely ordinary and unassuming, not preordained, noble, or having class or societal privileges, but complete happenstance, coincidence, luck, randomness, serendipity, synergy, whatever you want to call it. They help us feel better, especially when we are feeling too heavily with our right brain. Rational philosophers reject the notion of predetermination, but also refuse to acknowledge that chance and randomness is a natural occurrence. Because rational stories assume bad happens to bad in that whole like begets like, we begin to interpret our own lives as us deserving the bad things that happen to us. When misfortune is in reality an inevitable and indiscriminate occurrence in our lives. Stories that use the lucky twist prop up our left brain's sense of ease, especially as bad luck is a very comforting excuse for why things happen out of our control. Knowing tomorrow may bring a better day is what our left brain is best at reminding us. In other words, our left brain is the optimist, while our right brain is the pessimist. Fletcher uses Giovanni Francesco's Straparola's fairy tale Adamantina and the Doll as a shining example of the lucky twist, in which the little girl spends her older sister's remaining money on a doll when sent to the market rather than on food. Through complete chance, the doll is stolen and winds up in refuse, where a king just happens to find it in the trash, you know? But sorry in advance, it literally bites him in the ass and will not let go. Yes, this is the story. He puts out a proclamation for anyone who can pry the thing from his butt, and sure enough, when Adamantina comes forward and asks it nicely, it releases. The king marries her as a reward, and they never go hungry again. Fletcher also uses modern examples like Charlie Chaplin's The Gold Rush and The Wizard of Oz. He also brings up our more current obsession with comic superheroes, who often come into circumstances completely uncontrolled by their hand, and excels them into a whole new level of power. Even Superman, who is ejected as a baby from a very dying planet, lands on Earth and into the arms of human godparents. He himself returns the favor by being the random power who happens to descend from the sky to save other humans from peril, much like in ancient Greek theater. Many other superpower beings rise to power in such random and illogical ways like spider bites, explosions, vats of acid, that kind of thing. Contrast these to Harry Potter, who, although he starts off ordinary, is actually the dedicated chosen one of prophecy. And even more general, he is the child of wizards. Although presented with the notion that anyone can get a Hogwarts letter, we realize as poor 12-year-olds that we will not indeed be going to Hogwarts this year, or next year, or ever. That is Fletcher's feeling of literary hangover, in which we cannot achieve. Even though we love these characters, they're not accessible to us as much as we think they are. Fletcher uses this last example of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory by Roald Dahl, who uses both methods of chance and virtue. Charlie just happens upon a golden ticket that sends him on an exciting, albeit kind of creepy ride through a chocolate factory. However, his merit is what keeps him from being weeded out of the group tour, and eventually he inherits the chocolate factory because he never succumbs to greed and gluttony like the others do. His merit is what enables him to remain at the end and reap his reward. So, as you can see, literature is a battleground for optimists and pessimists, the left side and the right side of our brains. Even today, we see conflict and stigma that goes all the way back to the Enlightenment era and the rise of rationalism. The problem with pessimists like Charles Perrault, who call themselves rationalists, is that they refuse the notion that serendipity, happenstance, coincidence, synergy would be the term that scientists like Charles Darwin would use. It still exists in a world that we try to overly rationalize all the time, instead of acknowledging that chaos and chance, even natural selection, are undeniable and inevitable forces of nature. So my discussion questions for you today are, what is your favorite fairy tale? Analyze this story. Does it contain a lucky twist, poetic justice? What other stories can you think of that follow these plot devices? All right, thank you guys so much for joining me on this presentation, and I wish you all luck going further into the semester. Thank you guys so much.